I want to talk to you today about how ideas about masculinity, ideas about how to be a man, are deeply damaging to boys and men, and how we can move towards redefining a different and very much more holistic kind of masculinity that includes the full humanity of boys and men, including our vulnerabilities. So years ago, I was with a friend, and she was telling a story, and in the story, a man at some point had tears about something, and I remember her saying, he was crying like a baby. And I went, whoa, wait a second, how old was he? And she said, well, maybe 33. And I said, well, then he wasn't crying like a baby, he was crying like a 33-year-old man. And she went, oh yeah, okay, good point. These ideas about masculinity, which for me crystallized down into 5 words: be strong, comma, don't be weak. They cause a lot of problems for boys and men because they marginalize vulnerability, vulnerable feelings. And we know this. There's tons of people who have connected the dots on this story in a lot of different ways. You just pick up a newspaper today, wherever you happen to live, and you see some of the results of those stories: disconnection, violence, depression, etc. For me, the dot that I track the most in terms of looking at this story of vulnerabilities is that consistently, year after year, male suicides outstrip female suicides in this country and many other ones by a 3 to 4 margin, a 3 or 4 times higher margin. So it's not like we don't know better, it's like we don't act like we know better. So I want to spend most of my time today looking at what kinds of things we can do to actually move towards something different. And in doing so, what do those changes ask of us? So for a number of years, I've been involved with a youth leadership conference on Vancouver Island at Lester Pearson College. And we do a lot of things in that program. But one of them is we do some sharing circles. So in the sharing circle one time, there was 2 young men, and you just have a chance to go around, maybe 8 or 10 people, and say what's alive for you, what's in your heart, what's in your mind. And 2 of the young men had a few tears. But one of them did something really interesting. While he was sharing, he kind of lost interest in his storyline, and he got really interested in his feeling. And he had just a couple of tears coming down his face. And I remember he kind of tranced out on his story, and his hand came up towards his face, and he was touching his face, he was feeling them. And he said, I don't remember doing this before. After the session, he and the other young man were sitting together on the ground, and the rest of the group had started to move off for dinner. And I came over to them to sort of say hi and check in, and I said, are you guys coming for dinner? And they had their sort of arm around each other, and they kind of looked up at me looked back at each other like, can we just stay here for a while? We want to keep crying for a while. 15, 16-year-old young man. And for me, it was a beautiful expression of the simplicity of some story sharing and some really being, the experience of being heard well. And that in such a short time, that young man in particular had reconnected with something so simple and profound, like his own sense of grief about whatever. And that in that moment, it was so precious to him that he wanted to just stay with it and give up food. And if you've hung out with young men, you know that they want to eat their next meal every 17 minutes. I run a course for men in Vancouver called Manology, and it's a weekly drop-in course. And we also use a check-in process most sessions that we have. And there's a diversity of men there in ages from 20s to 70s, and there's a diversity of stories that get told each week, and it's always amazing. But what's really consistent, no matter what diversity there might be happening, is that it gets expressed 2 or 3 times during each go-round and afterwards, that there's an appreciation that as men are sharing their story, that they're hearing themselves in each other's stories. And in doing so, they're reminded, again, that they are not alone in their experiences, their questions, their vulnerabilities, their humor, etc. But over time, I've become amazed and concerned at this dynamic that men who are beautiful, wise, intelligent people could ever have believed in the first place that they were alone in such universal stories. And to me, that again underlines with amazement and concern the pervasive power of this be strong, don't be weak kind of messaging, that it isolates us from believing that anyone else could possibly be having the same experience. I want to bring women into the story as well. And I want to reference the research of very famous TED talker Brene Brown and her work on shame and vulnerability. And she noted in some of her research, talking to the men, some of the men were saying, look, my wife, my girlfriend, they didn't say that, I'm pretty sure. My wife, my girlfriend, she really wants me to open up. She says, tell me how it's really going on. I want to know all of you. Tell me what's happening on the inside. But when I do, she can't stand it. And then Brene Brown went and talked to some of the women, and she said, some of the men are saying this story is what's happening for you. And some of the women were saying, well, yeah, actually, it's true. When I see the vulnerability in him, it's scary. It scares me, and I want it to stop, and I don't want to see it again. So she learned in her research that one of the outcomes of this dance, this dynamic, was that some of the men were learning how to pretend to be vulnerable in the relationship, to ease the tension of both those perspectives. And for me, that's really concerning because it ties in again. It's not just hard for men to deal with, be strong, don't be weak. It's also a challenge for women in that way. And there are some stories in this work that are just way more complicated and harder to hold than others. So in recent years, I've been hearing more of this type of story. I'm hearing more stories from boys and men about being hurt or abused by a woman. And the men I know who have that experience are very, very progressive men. They are socially, politically very open-minded, and they have a rock-solid support and compassion for women's issues and women's rights. And they struggle mightily with also the tension of also having anger at some women who have hurt them and having no idea how to hold that story. Who's willing to listen to that story, and when's the right time to tell that story, and a deep underlying fear that if they do so, they may be sort of painted as like another angry man for speaking up in the first place. So, when I look at all these images, stories, experiences, etc., whether they're very specific to an individual or a big, huge societal frame, what crystallizes for me each time is, again, we need to define some kind of new normal for what masculinity is going to be about. And so I want to really focus on that. What would we be doing differently to do that? And again, what does that ask from us? So I want to offer 3 ideas, 3 actions. The first one is to share our stories. We are our stories. They are our sacred content. And particularly to encourage boys and men in our lives to share their stories and really encourage them to stay with the feelings that are connected to those stories. And to acknowledge, too, what we all understand about this masculinity stuff. Be a tough guy. Don't let their feelings show. And if we sense that when they're sharing, that some of that, if they're getting into that territory of wanting to shut it down, to try in the way that we might know best, based on the relationship we have with them, to let them know it's okay with us, that we're willing to go there together. The second one is to explore our relationship with our own fathers. If the father figure, even if we didn't have one, there's a place inside of us for father, like there is for mother. The father figure, to me, represents the archetype of masculinity. And so by learning more about our relationship with the father, we learn a lot about our perspective on masculinity on the whole, and in essence, something to do with how we relate to all boys and men in our lives. If our father is around, it's a process of sitting with him and story sharing. In particular, I really recommend asking our fathers to tell us stories about his father and how it was between them, or is still. And also stories about when our father was a slightly younger man and we were a kid. And so it helps us fill in the stories that we didn't really understand as a kid, the childhood impressions that were never the full picture, and gives us a better working relationship, understanding of our relationship with our dad in terms of his reasons for things, his successes and failures. If our father's not around, we can gather some people together and introduce our father through narration by describing him. And in particular, I recommend these things. What were his strengths and vulnerabilities? What were his fears and passions? Where was the place in the house he hung out? What were his hobbies and enjoyments? And then digging a little deeper. What's something that I always wanted to hear from him and have not yet heard or never did? And what's something that I always wanted to say to him or ask him that I never did or have not yet done? This kind of father work is a very powerful and simple way to get in touch with our relationship to masculinity. The third way, the last way, is to stop playing along with be strong, don't be weak. And this is an awareness practice. So it's trying to notice in our relationships with boys and men, are there places where, hey, I kind of marginalized or dismissed or was kind of dampening on something to do with that boy or man's fear or awkwardness in some way. And coming back to him and saying, hey, I think I did this thing that we do in our world, and I want to get out of it with you, and I want to go back to that moment and see what we can do if we did it differently together. So let's go back. Tell me that story again, please, and keep going this time. I'm with you. These ideas are pretty straightforward, and I'll also say they're not easy slogging at times, but they facilitate a pathway to what I want to finish with, which is this. I've worked with over 20,000 boys and young men and adult men from every continent but Antarctica. And the consistent, enduring, repetitive theme that I see in them is that underneath all the layers of shame and punishment and weirdness and awkwardness that have been put on them and me about showing any kind of weakness, vulnerability being described as weakness in the be strong, don't be weak world, and all the levels of fear underneath that about really showing up, and I'm in that too, that underneath all that stuff, the consistent theme is we want to be seen, we want to be heard, we want to be known because we want to connect. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.